website, you've got like 30 or 3,000 of these little puffballs representing an hour that a parent has every year with their kid. And this little one, the yellow ones, represent 40 hours a year that the church has with a kid per year. So needless to say, the role of the parent in the life of the kid, especially in their faith journey, is very, very important. So how do we leverage that? How do we influence that and make the most of that? In week one, I kicked us off looking at the Deuteronomy 6 passage. Some of the principles that I talked to us about is kids need parents who love God. Remember that Deuteronomy 6 passage is the one that says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I talked about kids need parents who will lead intentionally. We talked about those rhythms of life that Deuteronomy 6 talks about of when you wake up and when you go to bed and when you lie down and when you walk along the road and when you eat and when you're, for us, when you're driving in cars, right? So we talked about that. And then I ended with kids need parents who will help them prepare for the next phase and advance in their relationship with God. Week 2, Noah came up here and talked about some of the principles of parenting. We looked at that Mark 10 passage that talks about letting the little kids come to Jesus, and he kind of flips a culture on its head because kids were kind of outcast and looked down upon, and he's like, no, let them come to me. Noah pointed out that we need to view kids created in the image of God and love kids in a manner that is consistent with their personalities and needs. And last week, if you were here, we heard from David, and he talked about the importance of discipline in a kid's life, and not just discipline for the sake of discipline's sake or behavioral modification, but he connected the two of discipline with discipleship. He said there's things that we don't just need to not be or don't do, but there's things that we need to actually be. He took us on a journey through the later half of Ephesians, and he says we need to be an example. We need to be full of truth, be a builder and not a destroyer, and be someone who is eternally minded. If you didn't catch last week's sermon, I highly encourage you to jump online, get on YouTube, get on our website, and go back and watch that. In week 1, I touched on the idea that this sermon series is touching actually 2 of our ministry values here as a church, and one of those is that the next gen is worth our sacrifice, and that the other one is that family matters, that the family is the best place for discipleship to happen. So throughout these weeks, as we've been hearing these different topics, we've been seeing these different illustrations, what can we kind of summarize it as the important for us as parents and adults and as church leaders and ministry leaders? And I would say it's this: to live and model what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus to those in our care. To live and model what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus to those in our care. Because remember, the church and the family are the 2 entities that God has created specifically to make disciples and accomplish his mission. The church and the family, nothing else. So today, as we go in a direction of kind of wrapping up this whole series, and we kind of look at like, now what, where do we go from here, and tie together everything we heard, I'm going to let you guys know that today's message is going to be a little bit more practical, a little bit more applicable than it is going to be theological. Okay, a little bit more practical and applicable, because I feel like as parents and as a congregation, moving forward, how can we best parent and lead the next generation in whatever phase they are in? And since today is going to be a little bit more practical and applicable, I thought I'd start off by giving you guys and sharing just a few more resources that we find handy and helpful as a next-gen ministry team. And maybe somewhere along the road, if this series has like convicted you in any way, or you're just kind of saying like, man, I just need to get better or more knowledgeable at some of this stuff, here's some of the resources. In week 1, I told you guys about these parenting phase guides. This organization has created guides for every age group, and all of our ministry environments have these booklets in the area as a parent resource. So if you want to grab one of whatever age your kid is, it's a super easy, quick read it, bring it back, put it on the shelf, and bless another parent with it. Also got this one called Intentional Parenting. It's written by Doug and Kathy Fields. If you recognize the name Doug Fields, he has been a youth ministry guru for probably 40 plus years, and so they just share their experience of life in ministry and as a family and parenting, and just make it practical tips and helpful. It says 10 ways to be an exceptional parent in a quick fix world. So not only is it a workbook, there's some video-based stuff. You can grab that as well. This next one is called Parenting Beyond Your Capacity. The subtitle is Connect Your Family to a Wider Community. As a next-gen team, we really, really love this book, because this book enforces the connection between family and church, how that the 2 influences combined can make a greater impact. So in this book, you've got chapters like imagining the end in mind, and fighting for the heart, and widening your circle, the idea that community matters, and getting more people involved. So highly encourage that book. And this last one is called It's Just a Phase, So Don't Miss It. Now, I don't know if I'd necessarily call this one a book, because it is hefty. It is a chunk, so I wouldn't really encourage you to go out and buy it per se, but if you enjoy this kind of stuff of like, man, what does each age group need at a particular phase? This organization, same one that wrote those phase guides, has researched, has studied years and years and expert minds that have compiled this information of what each age group needs at a certain phase. So if you remember, a few weeks back, Noah mentioned some words in his message where he said each age group needs a particular thing at each phase. And those words are embrace, engage, affirm, and mobilize. This book is actually where we pull those things from. And so when you take a step back and look at the trajectory of the kid from growing up as a baby toddler through their elementary, middle school, high school days, you see these words play out. So I'm going to go through them real quick, and then we'll dive into our stuff today. So in an early childhood phase, so a baby, a preschool, a toddler, that's the phase that we need to embrace them in their phase of life. To play on the ground with them, to hold them, to show them that they are safe, that they're okay, that they're loved, and that they're able. When kids are embraced in this phase, they get small glimpses of what a heavenly Father looks like and how He cares for them. In the elementary phase, that's when we need to engage them. Engage their silly questions and their awkwardness and their new groups of friends and their hobbies and their passions and abilities. When we engage in their imaginations and help them see that they have what it takes and that they have our attention. When we help them see these things and they begin to see how their story can intersect with God's story, we engage their interest of a child and it provokes in them an interest of knowing God personally. Then as you grow up, you get the middle school phase, and the word there would be affirm. Now I know this word probably has maybe some negative connotations in your life, and I don't want to say like the affirm that like our culture would probably say right now of affirm sexuality or identity or whatever that looks like, but I would say affirm their faith journey, affirm their identity in Christ, affirm their giftedness, their talents and abilities when you see them in them. In our student ministry, we would call that kingdom worker, right? Like how can you use your gifts to be a kingdom worker for God? This age group is trying to figure out where they belong, what they like, and when we affirm their identity in Christ at this phase, it creates in them that they know they have a safe place to process insecurities and doubts. And then lastly, the high school phase is the mobilization phase. We are mobilizing them out into the world and to do what's next. This phase is where a lot of stuff changes. Obviously, you have the physical changes, right? Those are natural. Those are going to happen. But you also got changes that are happening emotionally, socially, spiritually. And in this phase, we are definitely preparing them for what's next. What will they do with their lives? Why should they believe in God? Do they matter in life, etc.? When we mobilize a teenager's potential for the kingdom, it develops in them a sense of personal vision, direction, and purpose for their future. So parents, understand the influence that you have in a son or daughter is a lot. It can be a lot of pressure because at any given phase, we're wearing a lot of different hats, right? Sometimes you might feel like a mix of a teacher, a coach, a counselor, or a friend. So if a lot of this is overwhelming to you, let me just give you like a one-sentence summary for whatever phase you might be in, okay? So if you have a preschooler, embrace their physical needs. If you have an elementary age child, engage their interests. If you have a middle schooler, affirm their faith journey. And if you have a high schooler, mobilize their potential. Because remember this, we've been using this definition of what a phase is, and a phase is a time frame in a kid's life when you can leverage distinct opportunities to influence their future. So no matter what phase you're in, recognize that every phase matters, and what you do at every phase matters. Now that's not to say that every phase is going to be smooth sailing, right? At every phase, we're going to have obstacles and battles and hurdles and opportunities and struggles and also just present realities. So what do we do and how do we prepare for and overcome the things the world hits us with when we're presented with these present realities in each phase? So far in this series, we've taken a look at Deuteronomy 6, the Shema. We've taken a look at Mark 10 of letting the little kids come to Jesus. We've taken a look at Proverbs, which Proverbs are just wise sayings, okay? Proverbs are not promises. It's not saying if you do this, it's a guarantee it's going to come true. They're just good, wise sayings. So the one in particular we looked at, right, is train up a child in the way he should go, Proverbs 22, right? And last week, David drew our attention to Ephesians, right, and what it looks like to parent. Today, I'm going to back up and go all the way to the beginning. Okay, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 2 today. Just going to read one quick verse over us and kind of spend some time and let us see what that verse has to teach us today. Genesis 2, verse 24 says this: "That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." Now, as you heard me read that verse, you're probably thinking, Ryan, this is a parenting series, not a marriage series, right? And rightfully so. This verse is often read at weddings, right? Paul actually quotes this verse in Ephesians in the section that David drew our attention to last week. And even though this verse is typically a quote-unquote marriage verse, this morning we're going to view it as a parenting verse because in the short verse, as short as it is, it can teach us a lot. And not only teach us a lot of like some biblical principles and values, but I think it also exposes a lot in our human tendencies and in our human nature. So this morning, what I'm going to go through is a few things of what I think this has a tendency to expose us to, okay? The first thing that we see is the verse said, a man will leave his father and mother, okay, and be united to his wife. So that means leave physically, relationally, emotionally, spiritually, hopefully financially, right? That they're going to leave. And so if we adhere to this verse, then we all constantly need to be preparing them for what's next in the next phase of life. And here's what's interesting about that part of the verse, the leave, the portion of the verse. When you're on the kid or the teenager side of that verse sounds really enticing to you, right? Like you get that verse. It's like a teenager's like, yeah, I can't wait to leave my parents' household. I can't wait to get out from under their roof. I can't wait to do my own thing and not be under their rules. On the parent side of this verse, and we hear leave their father and mother, we're like, I don't know if I want that to happen, right? We want to pull back the reins. We're kind of like, whoa, I'm not ready for you to leave. I don't want you to grow up. So some of the human nature tendencies that tend to come out from that this verse exposes us to, I'm going to call them we tend to this morning, okay? We tend to do these things. And when I say we, I'm not talking about we like Ridge Christian. I'm just saying like we as a society, we as a culture, we as a collective group of people have a tendency to do these things. The first one that we tend to do is we tend to accelerate childhood milestones, and delay adult milestones. We tend to accelerate child milestones and delay adult milestones. I referenced this a few weeks ago when I talked about how there's just some phases and some stages that sometimes as parents we want to get out of quicker than others, right? Like let's get out of the diaper stage, right? Can we get out of that one quicker? Let's get past the teething stage. Can we go to how quick someone might go from crawling to walking, right? There's some stages that we want to get out of faster. And what's interesting is those examples, a lot of times parents, whether they realize it or not, cognitively, subconsciously or consciously, sometimes we get competitive in those things, right? Some parents start talking about like, well, yeah, my kid started walking at 16 months. And they're like, yeah, well, my kid started walking at 13 months. And then they're like, well, my kid potty trained at 13 months. And they're like, well, my kid potty trained at 3 months. And it's like, okay, not realistic, right? Like, we're not potty training at 3 months. Come on, like let's be honest, right? But generally speaking, in that 0 to 10 years old gap, we have a tendency to move pretty quickly through the phases and through the stages and to move on to what's next. So whether it's sports or academics or just some of those natural, physical, cognitive, developmental skills that I just talked about, we're always faster. But something happens when we hit that 10, 11, 12, 13 mark in the life of a kid that this engine inside them, even put there by God, starts to pull away, starts to live out this idea of individualization and separation. And Genesis 2:24 has kicked in whether we want it to or not. So what you have a tendency to start seeing is when a parent notices this in the life of a kid, when you notice that, they're starting to pick their own friends, their own friend group. We're not setting up play dates for them anymore, right? They're wanting to pick out their own clothes. They're wanting to make their own decisions. And when mom and dad sense this, we start to freak out, right? Because everything up to this point was go, faster. And then all of a sudden we're like, whoa, slow down, right? You don't need to drive just yet. You don't need a job just yet. You're only 28. I mean, come on. Do you need to move out of the house right now? Come on, we want to slow things down. And what's interesting is when you look at the Bible, you see adulthood and you see childhood. You don't really see anything in between. But in 1904, we created the term adolescence, right? This idea of in between childhood and adulthood. And now in modern era, you have what's called prolonged adolescence. So oftentimes parents are slowing down kids making their adult milestone decisions, things like moving out, getting a job, getting married, having kids, and many aren't doing these milestones until they're in their 30s. So another human nature tendency that I think has added to this stigma of prolonged adolescence is this. We tend to give our children too much privilege and not enough responsibility. We tend to give them too much privilege and not enough responsibility. Again, I'm not trying to lay a guilt trip on any of us. I think this is something we all do. Again, it's a collective we. But these are some things that we need to acknowledge and maybe adjust in our lifestyles, because when we give them responsibilities, that is when they begin to grow. That is when they begin to take ownership. And see, our world is full of different kinds of parenting styles. And maybe you've heard some of these phrases before, right? Titles like free-range parenting or attachment parenting or helicopter parenting. There's a new one that's come on the scene, and I say new loosely. It's probably been on the scene the past handful of years. It's called lawnmower parenting. Don't know if you guys have ever heard of this one. Lawnmower parenting is this idea that the parents are literally mowing down anything in the kid's path, so the kid just has a nice, smooth ride in front of them. Okay? Lawnmower parenting is defined as this: removing all obstacles that may cause discomfort, challenges, or struggles. This parent not only helps their child, but probably does a lot of the work for the child, or at least checks to make sure that everything is correct. This form of parenting has become so prevalent in our society that over the past handful of years, this generation that's gone off to college, that major colleges and universities have had to stop allowing parents to contact the professors or administration offices, because the parents are going into the professor's office and fighting the battle for the kid and saying, why is my kid have an F? Why is he flunking? Why does he have a D? And the professor's like, because he or she doesn't show up to class. Like, of course they're flunking. Like, that's the reason, right? And so we've tried to set these smooth courses for them instead of giving them responsibility. Jim Burns, maybe it might be a name that you're familiar with. He's pretty big in he has an organization called Homeward, very big in the family dynamics, has an organization called Homeward, and this is what he says on their website: no teen will become a responsible adult if their parents carry the load for them. No teen will become a responsible adult if their parents carry the load for them. And I'm not saying be hands-off. I'm not saying you step out of the way and just let your 11, 12, 13-year-old figure out life by themselves. But whatever phase we're in, we have a chance to come alongside them and do life together. So if you're in that phase where kid's about to drive and they're wanting a car, okay, let's figure it out together. How are we gonna buy that car? Right? If they want to buy that new PlayStation or new video game, okay, let's figure it out together. Let's see what that looks like. You want to go on that youth trip this summer that costs a lot of money? I get it. I understand it, parents, right? Like, let's talk about, like, what does getting a job look like? What does mowing some yards look like? What does babysitting look like? Right? We have a chance to come alongside them and help them figure it out. Because one of the biggest mistakes that we make as parents is treating our children like children up until the day we expect them to be adults. Whew. That hits, right? Which leads me to my next one. Another human nature tendency that we can be guilty of is that we create environments for our children to succeed rather than teaching them to succeed in environments we can't control. Dwell on that for a little bit. And again, not laying guilt trips here. I think this is something we're all guilty of. Like, when you think about the kids that are at church today, they're at church because we picked their environment, right? We picked where they're going to church. Now, there might be some kids here that were like, hey, I want to go to this church, and mom and dad obliged because you're like, my kid wants to go to church, I'm taking them to church, right? But think of all the things that we pick for them and create the environments for them, right? We picked what town you're living in. We picked what neighborhood you are in. We picked what school you're going to. We created these environments. And we've created environments for them to succeed rather than teaching them to succeed in environments we can't control. So what would it look like to prepare them for environments that they can't control? An example would be, let's say you have your 3rd, 4th, or 5th grader and they come home from school and they don't like their teacher, right? Their teacher's really difficult or hard on them, right? And what the normal case would be in this day and age is mom and dad would usually go to the principal's office or the school administration and say, hey, can we pull little Jimmy or Sally out of this class and put them with another teacher, right? That was probably the normal rule of thumb. But what if we just took that whole school year to navigate what does it look like to handle a difficult person? Right? Because heaven forbid, when that kid grows up, I'm not saying it will happen, but most likely could happen that when they get a job, they might have a difficult boss, right? Or they move into a certain neighborhood, or someone else moves into their neighborhood, and now they have a difficult neighbor, right? Or a difficult coworker, or a difficult pastor. right? Like, if we've just removed that pain and suffering from them and not teach them how to handle those situations, we're not doing them any good. So instead of pulling them out of the pain or the hurt or their loss of a particular situation and environment, what if we came alongside them in that phase? Because what we need to understand is that parenting is a journey from control to influence. If you remember in week 1, I had a whole bunch of jars over on this side of the stage that had a whole bunch of marbles in them. And those marbles depicted the 936 weeks that we have as a parent from the time the kid is born to the time they graduate and typically leave our house. Right now, when that jar is full of marbles and we have all those weeks with them when they're younger, we have a lot of control in their lives, right? Like, we can depict what they're doing, the activities they're a part of. We can kind of control certain situations. But as that jar of marbles gets less and that kid is growing up and making their own decisions, our control is getting less and less, but it should be transferring to more and more influence. Okay? So you see this with young adult people, right? Like they've left the house. You're not controlling how they live anymore. You're not necessarily parenting them in that manner, but their interaction with you just looks different. Right? Their washer and dryer breaks down, and now they're calling mom and dad like, hey, how do I fix this? And you might talk them through it, or they don't have the tools, and so they might run over to your house to grab the tools, right? Or they're asking you financial questions. Hey, how much should I set aside for retirement or giving or just financial security, right? They're calling mom and dad like, hey, how do I make this bowl of ramen or scrambled eggs, right? And it's like they're still looking to you for influence, but you just don't have that control anymore. So how do we have influence at that phase of life? We do it by all the things that we've talked about in the series up to this point. We talk about it by doing the Deuteronomy 6 stuff, by loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, by creating rhythms in our lives and in our kids' life of what it looks like to live out of faith of when you get up and when you lie down, when you're in your car or when you're eating at the table or eating in the car. 2 weeks ago, Noah talked about how loving the child that you have in front of you with their personalities and needs, not one that you wish you had or that was better at blank. You do this by shifting your parenting skills and abilities to what David talked about last week, to be an example, to be full of truth, to be a builder, not a destroyer, to someone who needs to be eternally minded. That when we look around us and see that kids are created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, I think it changes how we have an eternal perspective on kids in our world, in our community, and especially kids in our household and as we parent them. The last human nature tendency that I think we can be guilty of is that we tend to make kids ultimate. We tend to make kids ultimate. Here's what I mean by that. I think a lot of parents, myself included, are guilty of the term living vicariously through your kids. Right? You've probably heard this phrase before. You've maybe even said it in regards about another parent. Oh, they're just living vicariously through their kids. Right? And what that mentality does is what we want them to do is be better at or excel at or have a better lifestyle than we did growing up. So to be better at something than we were, to have a better life than we had growing up, and this means we're willing to do anything to make that happen. You really see this right now in the sports world. And I feel like I can talk about this because I'm living it right now. Baseball used to have seasons, right? But now you have this thing called competitive baseball, and you have tournaments on weekends, on Saturdays and Sundays, and I feel like I'm constantly having to remind myself of that 1 Timothy 4 passage that says, okay, for physical training is of some value, but godliness has eternal value for this life and the life to come. Right? And that yes, I want my son to be a part of a sports team, and yes, I want him to learn the fundamentals of baseball, and yes, I want him to be on a team that he enjoys his teammates and he enjoys playing the game. But it is so hard to also set boundaries as a family and just say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to play the Sunday morning games, and we're going to miss out on them. And it's tough. It's tough as a coach. It's tough as a player that we have to miss those games, but at the same time, I feel like we're setting an example for our kids on the importance of church. And not just church for church attendance sake, not old school, like, hey, you were here, let's mark it off the list, but everything else that entails. The importance of community, the importance of their spiritual growth, the importance of the relationship with Jesus. Ultimately, we're wanting to fight for the heart, which is one of the chapters in this book I mentioned earlier. There's a church in Branson called Woodland Hills Family Church. Some of our church members even visit it sometimes when they go to Branson on like family vacations. But just as their church name says, they are very pro-family. Anytime they can teach on it, preach on it, they will. Anytime they can reinforce just family values and the importance of God-honoring families, to the point that Deuteronomy 6 is like the heartbeat of their church. It's like what they focus their church around. The lead pastor there is quoted with saying this: "We are about eradicating the kid-centered home." Pooh, ouch. But I kind of like that statement because it fights against our tendency to want to make kids ultimate in our households. He goes on to say, and he's used the illustration before, that if you were to ask his then 5-year-old, hey, what does Christian maturity look like according to Genesis 2:24? And he says that I will not be with mom and dad forever, so plan accordingly. I will not be with mom and dad forever, so plan accordingly. As mom and dads, maybe these are some things we need to get better at. That we need to tell our kids, I love you. You're a welcomed addition to our home, but you are not the center of it. So as we begin to wrap up our time together, let's just sit in some of the truth that Genesis 2:24 has to offer for us. Remember that it says, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. The biblical principle I want us to understand today is this, that the bond between the husband and wife should be stronger than the bond between the parent and the child. It just should. The bond of marriage is just different. It's a bond. It's a covenant. It's like a glue that a child will not be with us forever, and you empty nesters know that. You've experienced that your kids will not be with you forever, and your relationship just looks different, but not control. And so when your kids get married, no longer should the first phone call on a good day or a bad day be a call to mom and dad. It should be to husband or wife. Not saying you can't ever call them, as we talked before, just the conversation looks different, right? So we like the leaving home physically, like, yes, it's time for you to get out of my house. But we struggle with the leaving home relationally and emotionally. We love the leaving home financially, hopefully, right? But we need to understand this, a principle that applies to all of us, not just a parent of a baby through a 12th grader, is that parenting is for a season, but being a parent is for a lifetime. Parenting is for a season, but being a parent is for a lifetime. Here's what I mean by that. Kids will grow up and become adults themselves, and no longer will we be parenting them, but we should still have influence in their life, and you will always be their parent. So for as long as Lindsay and I are alive, we will always be a parent to Alexis, Easton, Hallie, and Cadence, but there will be a time, there will be a phase in their life where we will no longer be parenting them, but simply have influence in their lives. So if a phase is a time frame in a kid's life when you can leverage distinct opportunities to influence their future, I'm going to ask us, how are we doing with that? Right? How are we doing with that influence? It's the same question I asked in week 1, and I think it's a question that applies to all of us today. How are we doing with leveraging distinct opportunities and influencing their future? Because this doesn't just go for parents. It goes for our early childhood workers. It goes for elementary volunteers. It goes for student ministry small group leaders. And yes, our church as a whole. Yes, it starts at home, but how are we collectively doing with that? When you jump ahead in the New Testament and you get to 2 Timothy, you see the words that Paul writes to Timothy, letting him know about like his upbringing. 2 Timothy 1 verse 5 says this, I am reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. This is a cool passage because I feel like it's Deuteronomy 6 literally jumping off the page. Like it's a real life Deuteronomy 6 story saying, hey, your mom and your grandparents like implemented this into you. Now it's your time to live it out. Paul goes on in chapter 3 that he tells Timothy, hey, don't stop, don't quit. And maybe this is a lesson for some of the teens in here or young adults in here. But at this point, here's what he says in 2 Timothy 3 verses 14 and 15. But as for you, continue in what you have learned and have become convinced of, because you know those from whom you've learned it, and how from infancy you have known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. That is the key part of that verse, that last sentence there, and it's the key part of our message this morning, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. Moms and dads are always going to be bombarded with certain things at certain phases of life. What I would call sometimes non-essential things, but they're just things that we have to answer and have to navigate through. Like, should we give the kid a binky or not? When should we potty train? When should we have them start reading? Where do we put them in public school, private school, homeschool? When do they get a cell phone? How long should they be on their devices? How long do we give them screen time? Is it during the week? Is it during the weekends? When should they start driving? When should they get a job? When should they fill in the blank, right? It's a lot of stuff that we have to navigate, and rightfully so, we should, but don't let those things crowd out the most important thing, and the most important thing is faith in Jesus, salvation in Jesus, hope in Jesus, as David mentioned last week. So no matter what phase you're in, if you're in that toddler baby phase, God bless you. If you're in that elementary, middle school, figuring out how to navigate life with a teenager phase, maybe you have a young adult kid that's already moved out of the house, or the prodigal son and daughter that has turned away from the faith. We haven't even touched on that in the series. And if that's you, I know your heart aches and breaks for them, and I would just encourage you to keep praying. Keep praying that one day they would return, not just to your household, but to God. So we're not here to place blame or to lay guilt trips. That's not what we want. But many parents do often say, man, I wish I had known more. I wish I had done more. I wish I had said more. I wish I could go back and ... I just know that when it comes to our kids, I think sometimes we take either too much credit or put too much blame on how they turned out. So no matter what phase you're in, stop feeding any regrets that you might have and just start asking God to redeem the remaining days that you do have. Why? Because you have influence. Your children, your grandchildren are still watching and still listening. So our ultimate desire for this church and for parents is to instill faith in those that God has entrusted to our care. And I've said before in this series, I think this goes beyond just a parenting series. This goes beyond just parents of a K through 12th grade student. This applies to all of us. So if you're single, if you're married, if you have kids, if you don't have kids, if you're an empty nester, grandparent, great-grandparent, if you're an early childhood worker, an elementary worker, student, small group leader, we all have a responsibility to leverage distinct opportunities to influence faith in the next generation. Let's pray. God, I thank you for this time and a chance to just be in your presence, be with your people. And God, as we wrap up this series, I pray it's something that we could take to heart. I pray that no matter where parents are at, God, that your spirit would just be on them, to not feel guilty, to not feel burdened, but to just feel your presence and to keep doing what they're doing, encouraged by your spirit and how we can continue to love and grow together, how the church and the family can partner together and what it looks like to raise this next generation. God, I pray no matter where we're at in this realm that we would also come alongside each other, encourage one another, help each other, and God, ultimately leverage influence and faith, ignite faith in the next generation. You're God, and we thank you for that. It's in your awesome and powerful name I pray. Amen.